Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today we're digging into On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the one and only George Lazenby Bond film, which up until recent decades was something of the black sheep of the Bond franchise. It certainly wasn't beloved when it came out upon release in 1969, but in the past few decades has seen such a groundswell of support and love from both Bond fans and people who stand outside the Bond community, acclaimed filmmakers such as Steven Soderbergh, Peter Jackson, Christopher Nolan. All of them have rallied in support of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But even when I was starting to get into this hobby, which was to say at the tail end of the 90s and coming into the online Bond community, On Her Majesty's Secret Service was not especially beloved. It was controversial. Yes, it had its advocates, but the place it holds now, which is almost canonical in the film series, and that canonical status was almost fully cemented by No Time to Die, treating it as a reference point, regardless of what you feel about No Time to Die. No Time to Die makes a big point of going out of its way to reference On Her Majesty's Secret Service as one of the most essential Bond film predecessors. That's a relatively recent thing. I found the film a strange experience when I first saw it, as I was becoming a Bond fan. It was one of the last Bond films I got around to seeing because it was just the kind of odd man out. And it didn't really get shown a lot in the TV marathons of my day, which was how I saw most of the Bond films. My family owned the Connery films on VHS, but we didn't own any of the others. So I was at the mercy of things like the TBS TV marathon to get caught up on the other Bond films. And On Her Majesty's Secret Service was always kind of given an awkward time slot placement somewhere around like 11 p.m. or something, playing into the early hours of the morning. Today, it is one of my absolute favorites. And you know that if you have seen my recent ranking video, which I published for James Bond Day. I have so much to say about On Her Majesty's Secret Service that we'll find out if I need a second video as I record this. All my videos are off the cuff. They are kind of stream of consciousness for better and worse. So as I go through On Her Majesty's Secret Service, there's so much that we could dig into in this film, which was essentially the first time the James Bond series attempted a reboot. It's interesting to see how On Her Majesty's Secret Service approaches the transition between Sean Connery and George Lazenby. They acknowledge it up front in the movie with an in-joke to the audience, the famous "this never happened to the other fella" line, with George Lazenby essentially doing the equivalent of looking out at the audience and saying, yes, I know I'm not the guy you're used to in this role, but we're starting to do something new. But then the movie kind of leans in with a number of in-jokes referencing prior Bond adventures. You know, you get the title sequence with the iconic John Barry theme, which is just essentially clips from the Connery era, reminding you that this is the culmination of an arc that was begun with Dr. No and carried through all the way to You Only Live Twice. And they make a point of this again during the scene in which Bond quits the Secret Service and is clearing out his drawer and has a rather improbable assortment of props and pieces from his prior adventures, like Red Grant's strangle cord watch and Honey Rider's diving knife. Why Bond would have these mementos in his office is a really good question, and obviously we're not meant to take it seriously. It's just a sort of nod back to the past. And as much as I adore On Her Majesty's Secret Service, we have to admit up front that this is a somewhat uneven movie. Unevenness, though, is not a damning sin. Unevenness just means that there are highs and there are lows, and the highs of this movie are so extraordinarily high that I really think this stands out as one of the exemplary Bond adventures. But there is a bit of awkwardness here, and you get that from the outset in not quite knowing how to navigate the transition between Connery and George Lazenby. And I'm really excited to have seen the Bond community somewhat rally around George Lazenby's Bond in recent years. Even as the film's reputation has risen, it's taken the Bond community a long time to rally around this particular interpretation of Bond. And I think Lazenby's Bond has his pluses and minuses. I really wish he had gotten to do more with the character, because I think we would have seen him grow substantially in his interpretation of the character. His final scene with Tracy, that wonderful, tragic, devastating scene, arguably the most devastating scene in the series, is so exceptionally well acted that I would argue it is the most well acted scene in the entire series. And that's George Lazenby. That's not Daniel Craig or Timothy Dalton, the two people who are often singled out as being the thespian Bond actors. George Lazenby does that. But it does take him a little bit to find his footing here, and he has the somewhat impossible task of following Sean Connery, who, even when Sean Connery is just phoning it in, Sean immediately anchors the film frame. He's just charisma incarnate. George Lazenby is not that. George Lazenby actually, I think, is a more slightly subdued Bond. He really is ultimately, in his approach to performance, a little bit more in the Timothy Dalton vein, in the sense that this is like an internalized Bond, and he really needs a director who is going to pay attention to his subtleties. And the movie doesn't always give him room to display those subtleties. It's giving him a lot of jokey one-liners and things like that. And Lazenby is game for those. I think George Lazenby, contrary to many of the other Bonds, feels the most like a international playboy. He really is just a roguish rascal who loves the high life and seems to lead this wonderfully glamorous life. The way he's introduced into this movie is one of the best, introductions of a new Bond here in the series, with this wonderful silhouette introduction in his DB5 with this close-up of him lighting his cigarette. It is just absolutely stunning. And then we get this wonderful section just showing him on holiday, checking into a hotel. There's this sort of grand sweep to the luxury of this movie. In fact, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is an epic. Not an epic in the way that You Only Live Twice or The Spy Who Loved Me are Bond epics, but epics in the sense that this movie has some real sweep and grandeur to it. It has a kind of narrative sweep that the series really wouldn't attempt again until Casino Royale many years later, which is also similarly a Bond adventure and a tragic love story. On Her Majesty's Secret Service does it first, and I would argue with more grandeur, because it has some of the best cinematography and music of the series. Back to back, you have You Only Live Twice and On Her Majesty's Secret Service being two of the loveliest Bond films ever made. Just every shot looking stunning. John Barry operating at the height of his powers, taking everything that he had accomplished in the 1960s run of Bond and bringing it to this sort of feverish pitch where you simultaneously have the excitement of the Bond sound and this wonderful, rich, expressive, passionate, and romantic sensibility. It is really astonishing to watch this movie. It really feels so lush from the get-go, and that really plays into how we perceive George Lazenby's Bond, who is presented and introduced in this movie, really just living up the high life. It's a great introduction for a new Bond, narratively speaking. He is introduced as a rescuer in the pre-title sequence, and then he's immediately thrust into what Bond is like on holiday. Well, he's traveling, he's gambling at casinos, he's bailing beautiful, mysterious women who have attempted to commit suicide out of public scandal, and finding his way into this underbelly of society where he is making backroom deals with mobsters to find his ultimate foe, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. It's a really terrific narrative setup, and obviously the pieces were all laid there by Fleming, but the way that they structure this as a way of introducing a new Bond is actually pretty interesting. It makes you wish that they could have left some of the Connery baggage behind a little bit, and I think also they could have toned down a bit of the humor for George Lazenby. A lot of the humor feels a little forced, just kind of always layered in. In fact, many of the one-liners feel almost superimposed on the edit. If you watch this movie, it has some very impressionistic editing at times. Peter Hunt was a very forward-thinking editor. In fact, some of the quick cut action in this actually prefigures where action cinema would go decades later with things like Jason Bourne. I mean, those fistfights on the beach, things like that. But you also get these sort of edits that are a little bit more papering over cracks, where dialogue is kind of pasted when characters aren't talking and different things like that. You kind of feel that slightly disjointed nature of it. And many of the one-liners kind of almost feel added to the scene after the fact. George Lazenby has such a natural stature that he, in fact, has perhaps the best stature of any of the Bonds. I mean, he just looks so incredible in a suit. He looks so tall. He looks so physically imposing that you can almost use that to anchor the film frame. You don't need him mugging for the camera as much as he does. And I don't think George Lazenby actually feels as comfortable doing that as when he is doing some of the more dramatic scenes. A good example of that is his initial scene with Tracy in his hotel room, where he's actually very good switching to a more serious, tender space. It's when he's kind of a little bit more like jokey Bond that I feel like he hasn't quite found his footing. Comedy is actually very hard. One of the most amazing things about Roger Moore's Bond is that he makes comedy seem so easy and effortless. But if you really watch many of the other Bonds outside of Connery and Moore, they really struggle to embed an effortless sense of humor into their performances. And you feel George Lazenby doesn't quite have a sense for the rhythm, the musicality of comedy, because it's all about timing, it's all about pitch. And some of the dialogue he's given is quite funny, but it doesn't always land. It gets better as the movie goes along. I think there are some pieces where George Lazenby really starts to capture that sort of playboy exuberance. This is a Bond who is having a lot of fun in life. This is a Bond who is both a little tender and sentimental, but is really burning the candle as quickly as he can. This is a Bond with a real zeal for life. He feels pretty different from Connery's Bond in a lot of ways. Connery's Bond is a very cruel, dark character, even from the outset in Dr. No. He's not a very tender person. George Lazenby comes into this role, and he's at once a playboy Bond, but he has a softer, more intuitive side from the outset. And he's always very good in this movie when he's asked to bring that out. My favorite scenes in this movie are many of the more serious, dramatic beats. I love him in his conversation with Tracy. I love the conversation between Bond and Draco about Tracy. It's one of these romantic conversation scenes where Draco is essentially giving a monologue. I think this movie has so many moments like this. It is one of the most exceptionally well-written scripts. And George Lazenby really does well when he's given more of those dramatic moments. I think he would have been really great in a darker follow-up about him hunting down Blofeld after the the murder of his wife, a more revenge focused movie for that reason. He would have really been able to lean into those aspects of the character. And I think we were robbed of that follow up. But that's why this was a reboot that wasn't. It was originally supposed to end with Bond and Tracy's wedding, and then they were going to sail off on a happy ending. And that's one sense in which the movie would feel very complete. The movie's tone is this very peculiar blend of outlandish kind of comedy and 1960s exuberance with a bit of a return to the Terrence Young thriller tension of the early Bond films, really being that like Dr. No from Russia with Love sort of slow burn investigation style Bond adventure with a lot of intrigue, a lot of slow burn tension moments like that wonderful break into Gumboldt's office and safe cracking sequence where you get this really slow build momentum across the course of this movie, coupled with a really big like swinging 60s energy. It's no surprise that Austin Powers pulled from both You Only Live Twice and On Her Majesty's Secret Service when it was creating its parody of the Bond movies. Things like the kilt, the ruffled shirt, Bond, encountering a sea of women at Piz Gloria. This sort of 1960s exuberance sits with this more serious dramatic impulse that the Bond movies hadn't done before. And it's a somewhat uneasy marriage, let's be honest about it. And in some ways, that's because the film wasn't designed to end with Tracy's death. You really feel that when you watch the movie because the tone is so light and bright and bouncy. And if it had ended with Bond and Tracy just driving off into the sunset, having been married, it would feel a little bit more coherent. But by accident, almost, the scene that was intended to be the pre-title sequence of the next movie, Tracy's death, just hits all the harder because of this sort of jovial energy that precedes it. It's a film that is fairly celebratory of life and love up until that final dark, bitter moment. And it's handled with such a matter-of-factness that feels quintessentially British. It's ironic and it's dark and it occurs without fanfare. It is the complete opposite of the way that the Craig era would handle similar moments with Vesper's death, which gets this monumental fanfare. It gets a crashing building and all this pomp and circumstance with an elevator underwater and Bond reaching for her, or Bond's own death in No Time to Die with this spectacular Hans Zimmer farewell to the hero soundtrack cue as Bond is obliterated from the sky. No, On Her Majesty's Secret Service feels more in line with the bitter, dry irony of British storytelling. Death comes not as a grand dramatic moment, but as a quiet, melancholy moment at the side of a road. A man just cradling his wife in the car, unable to process the grief of that moment. And it just comes at such a sudden whiplash to the movie we've seen before. It's a true gut punch, but it's so brilliantly devastating because it just pulls the rug out from under you. Now, speaking about this movie's somewhat ungainly nature, I have always loathed and despised the way that final scene ends, and then John Barry's score like tries to pivot to the Bond theme immediately after that, as though to say like, okay, I get that was depressing. Don't worry, this is still the James Bond series. There's more James Bond to come. That has never worked for me. I know Bond fans who have tried to defend it to me over the years, but it just feels so unassured at that moment. So that I, even on my viewing in preparation for this video, I just kind of like instinctively clench a little bit when that happens. I almost want to pause the movie before the Bond theme can kick in so that the final notes of the movie are just the beautiful strains of the instrumental version of We Have All the Time in the World, which concludes the movie. Now, I've gotten 20 minutes into this video, and we've largely talked about the nature of Lazenby's Bond as a playboy, and we've talked about the series transition. We've talked about some of the tonal and structural issues of this movie, but we haven't dug deeply into all the wonderful things that this movie has to offer. So I think there probably is a part two here where I start talking about some of the other characters here, because there's so much to say about Tracy and Blofeld and their particular portrayals here, and the way that that starts to shift the nature of Spectre a little bit, and the way that this sets a precedent for what Bond's romance could look like. So as I envision what that next video will be, and I'll record that pretty soon after this and have that up as a part two, I just want to reflect on how this was the reboot that wasn't. On Her Majesty's Secret Service was such a dramatic shift from where You Only Live Twice had left off. You Only Live Twice was one of the grandest Bond movies ever made, and I love You Only Live Twice. But tonally, On Her Majesty's Secret Service was such an assured return to the ethos of the early Bond movies. It really felt like it was pulling Bond back to earth, pulling Bond back to Ian Fleming. And I wonder if the world was really ready for that. Certainly, you feel them swing dramatically in the other direction after On Her Majesty's Secret Service doesn't work out. We get Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, and The Man with the Golden Gun as a sort of loose Guy Hamilton, Tom Mankiewicz trilogy after this, with their sensibilities dominating the sort of hokey, jaunty energy of 1970s cinema with a bit of a almost like slightly exploitation film edge to it. It was very clear in all three of those movies that they weren't taking the Bond film thing very seriously. Live and Let Die was obviously a phenomenal success, one of the big blockbusters of the series overall. So they obviously had connected with the zeitgeist with Live and Let Die. On Her Majesty's Secret Service feels a little bit of a throwback for the cinema of 1969. It's not hard to see why it didn't quite connect with audiences, even if you put aside the George Lazenby of it all. And there's also the matter of it being a romance with such a tragic ending. It's such a whiplash from the way Connery's character, who is so dark and sardonic and not very sensitive. You know, he's established as a pretty cruel and aloof guy in his relationships with women, that you get this pretty hard pivot tonally, and that's on top of this film concluding with an ending that at the time must have left audiences so confused. I can't imagine if you had been raised on the prior 5 Connery movies in that trajectory, going to the theaters to see this and trying to process what this new Bond film was doing at that time. It was bold, but it probably wasn't set up in the way that it needed to be. I don't know that cinema had adjusted to the idea of transitioning series from one actor to another. This was a bold experiment that, you know, other series played around with, like the Inspector Clouseau movies tried to recast Peter Sellers and things like that. But the shift from Lazenby to Connery again indicates the way that this really was kind of a novel territory for a series of this popularity. I mean, James Bond was the Star Wars of its day. This was a global phenomenon that can't be overstated with mass media merchandising. I mean, this was the Star Wars of its day in every sense of the word. And it kind of walked so that Star Wars could run and create the true blockbuster phenomenon that would become, enshrined in stone during the 80s. And with that being the case, you almost needed something like a more dramatic pause or a more dramatic reestablishment of the character than just kind of trying to tie it to the Connery movies. You almost needed to treat Lazenby's Bond as a net new character because he is a net new character. He behaves pretty differently from what we would expect of Connery's Bond. Some have speculated what it would be like to have Connery's Bond in this movie, and it certainly would have been interesting to see Connery try to unite his interpretation of the character with the demands of this story, with the demands of a story that has Bond fall in love. It's almost hard to imagine Connery's Bond in the final scene of On Her Majesty's Secret Service cradling Tracy in the car. I don't know that it quite would have worked, though I would have loved to see it. Connery is an incredible actor, and it would have been interesting to see what Connery could have done with it. But I also want to offer an alternate proposal that would have been very interesting to consider from another angle. I have always thought, especially given the blending of tones in the final film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, that Roger Moore would actually have been rather good in this movie. All the humorous touches in this movie would have obviously come very easy to Roger Moore, but Moore at the time was very tied into his role as the Saint, and it's very easy to imagine Roger Moore in the Saint mode kind of blending very nicely into the tone of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, even with all the tough guy stuff that plays in this movie. And I think Roger Moore could have been really wonderful as a serious, romantic leading man. It's very easy to see, for me anyway, to see Roger Moore's Bond carry the romance with a little bit more earnestness than he was able to in subsequent adventures. And that might have been an interesting kickoff for the Moore era had he been able to begin in 1969. Though ultimately, I think we should be grateful that George Lazenby's Bond is the Bond of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, even though I don't think he anchors the film as like a true movie star the way that Sean Connery does. He allows the movie to just be received on its own terms. This is the only Bond film that doesn't really feel like it belongs to some era or have the baggage of an era. It is just truly a wonderful standalone detour from the rest of the series that became so essential to what the series would become because it's such a foundational moment for the character. This was the formative tragedy of the character long before the Craig era made Vesper the bedrock of Craig's interpretation of Bond. Bond's loss of his wife, the one woman who inspired Bond to tie the knot, was in some ways the crucible in which that character was truly formed, the true love of Bond's life. And the movie is soft and romantic in the way that you would want that to be, a true Bond epic. So stay tuned for part 2, where we dig into some of the other wonderful aspects of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But I will leave the conversation here for now. I look forward to discussing with you all how you feel about George Lazenby's Bond relative to Connery's Bond, how the movie handles that transition, and whether you agree with me that Roger Moore might have been a good choice for the role. I would be very eager to hear some engagement on that point, because I don't hear people suggest that a lot. I don't think it occurs to a lot of people. So let me know, and I'll catch you in the next one.